Today in the warehouse, we're going to take a look at the BFG KO2, that's BFGoodrich KO2, the tyre that is the one that everyone compares all other all-terrain tyres to, in Australia at least. We're going to take a look at that and actually compare it to 10 other tyres that you might be considering when you think about this tyre as well. So we're just going to look at the tread and the sidewalls today. We're not actually going to look at functionality and that sort of stuff, just because you're sitting at home and you're looking at the pictures on the internet, and we'll be able to give you more depth of insight into the difference between these tyres and the other ones you might be thinking about. So we'll start off by comparing it to the aggressive all-terrain end of the market, because the BFG KO2 actually sort of sits in between the regular all-terrains and the aggressive all-terrains. It's got features from both, but it's probably more in the aggressive all-terrain end of the market. So what I might do first is compare it to the Yokohama Geolandar X-AT. So this is the G016. So 3-ply sidewall tyre, 3-ply sidewall tyre. Both of these are tyres you would consider if you were going for longer distance travelling. So think, round Australia lap, really durable. Both, from what I've heard, have got, are looking towards high tread wear. In terms of the blocks, the G016 sort of has these larger blocks and more of a longitudinal groove than the KO2 does. And the longitudinal groove is actually more likely to help you evacuate water during times when you might be aquaplaning. So this, you can sort of see there, it's a bit of a broken longitudinal groove, or two of them, whereas the KO2 doesn't have quite as much of a proper longitudinal groove, although there is definitely one that you could trace through there. In terms of voids between the tread pattern, the KO2 and the shoulders does have some pretty decent gaps that I can fit my finger into. Even this one is actually on its side. And through the middle, I can fit the finger into the side, on its side, into much of the tread pattern. So relatively consistent gaps throughout the whole tread pattern. Whereas if you look at the Geolandar, I can fit it in on its side in most of the shoulder gaps. Probably not on its, oh no, I can't quite fit it in there. And then the tread blocks are actually denser through the middle here. And that's sort of where some of these aggressive all-terrains are heading these days, where you'll have a denser set of centre blocks and a wider set shoulder blocks. So in terms of siping, the KO2 isn't an overly heavily siped tyre, but the G016 is actually relatively similar in terms of siping, maybe a bit more siping. So siping is these little grooves here that help it grip in wet and also help the blocks move off-road as well. And they can be varying depths of cut too. In terms of the sidewalls, shoulders, they do actually have these stone ejectors on both tyres. So the KO2 one is slightly smaller than the X-AT. And then let's look at the shoulder, the actual shoulder. So interestingly, the X-AT actually has two different sidewalls. This is the slightly more aggressive one. Has decent coverage in terms of depth of rubber. But if you look at the actual upper sidewall, the corner of the tread face, then the KO2 is actually more aggressive here. So, it's like a finger depth and then a shoulder. So certainly the KO2 has the edge on that, because the more aggressive shoulder is actually going to help you climbing out of holes and that sort of thing. So whereas this one is more, it does have a little bit of variation there, but certainly not as aggressive as the KO2. And then looking down at the actual sidewall itself, there is actually a bit more of a rim protector here on the Geolandar X-AT, whereas the KO2 doesn't have much of a rim protector at all. I think we've covered everything from there, so let's move on. Next tyre off the rank is the Nitto Grappler. So let's start off on the tread pattern again, reset. So again, I've just banged on about this one in the last segment. So we'll focus more on the Grappler. So in the Grappler, it actually has much wider spaced shoulders than the X-AT, which we've just looked at. And on the whole, the shoulder blocks are actually wider spaced than the KO2. Whereas if you're looking at the center blocks, again, you have this sort of more densely packed center block than you have in the KO2. And it's a bit tricky because from the camera there, it probably looks like they're quite wide, but they have a bit of a ridge and then they come in on a bit of an angle, whereas the blocks on the KO2 are quite sheer, they're quite up and down. So the blocks in the center of the ridge grappler tread are actually more densely packed than what you'll see on the KO2. Siping, again, not very dense siping. I do know that this performs very well in the wet, which is interesting by the by. It's probably a little bit more interesting stuff going on in the actual tread pattern. Like there's all these little grooves and sort of connecty blocks and that sort of stuff happening here, whereas the KO2 definitely has this sort of quite wide, generous spacing throughout the whole tread pattern. Let's look at the shoulders. And interestingly, the ridge grappler shoulder is actually quite similar to the KO2 shoulder. So again, we've got that square shoulder and the alternating scalloped shoulder here as well. So, you know, I can fit a finger into that and a finger into that. We won't go into tread depths at all, but it'll be interesting to actually look at the difference in tread depth between these two. In terms of the actual coverage with additional rubber for puncture resistance, then I would say that the ridge grappler actually has a little bit more depth to the protection, but it's actually a bit more spotty. Note that the ridge grappler actually has different shoulder or different upper sidewall patterning on each side. So it's something to check out when you're looking to buy them, and making sure they've actually installed them with all the right ones facing out. But again, the KO2 has such good coverage in the upper shoulder that certainly it has more coverage in terms of rubber depth, rubber density than the ridge grappler. In terms of the block size as well, again, the ridge grappler has bigger blocks than what you're seeing on the KO2. So this has, you know, those sort of smaller blocks. Even the shoulder blocks are quite a lot bigger than what you're seeing on the KO2. And in terms of longitudinal grooves, we've got pretty excellent longitudinal grooves coming along through here. I mean, I say excellent, but again, you can take your choice. So this will help with that water dispersal. That's about all I've got to say about the ridge grappler for now. So next tyre up is the Toyo Open Country RT. And this is probably one of the more aggressive all-terrain tyres that we have here in the warehouse at the moment. And you'll see that the shoulder grooves are actually quite widely spaced. So in some of these, I can actually even rattle my little finger around a little bit. And even through these middle grooves here, we'll actually see a fair bit of depth, a fair bit of width. And so through the center blocks here, it's actually a little bit less densely packed than the last couple of tyres we've looked at as well. So the KO2 is probably more densely packed through the tread pattern than you're looking at with the RT. So that's interesting because it means that perhaps the RT is going to have more traction off-road, but the on-road performance will be interesting to look at. In terms of the longitudinal grooves, there's certainly, you know, it's a lot more interrupted than the previous tyres we've looked at, probably on par really with the KO2. So no real longitudinal groove there. Tread block size, maybe the tread blocks are a little bit more solid than the KO2. Through the middle here, perhaps the same sort of, you know, maybe there's a little bit more solidness, a little bit more width and depth to the tread blocks through here, but again, it's sort of much of a muchness. So let's look at the shoulders a bit more. And you'll see that we've actually got stone ejectors in both tyres, probably similar sort of depth, although some interesting sort of split stone ejector action going on some of the alternating grooves on the RT. In terms of the actual upper shoulder, we do have some scalloping, but again, the scalloping on the RT actually isn't as deep as the scalloping on the BFG. In terms of the upper shoulder, upper sidewall, sorry, there is actually quite a lot of extra rubber a little bit further down on this tyre in comparison to the previous tyres. But there is a little bit more, I don't know, less depth between this fanciness and the actual upper shoulder. So I'll be interested to see the actual depth of rubber there. So again, the KO2 comes up tops here because it has so much extra rubber just across the whole upper shoulder. Oh, interestingly, I haven't actually been looking at white sidewalls, but none of these tyres at the moment have white writing, whereas the KO2 actually does have white writing. So all three tyres up until now have been 3-ply sidewalls in most of their sizes. So the KO2 is a 3-ply sidewall, and so was the RT, the X-AT, and the Ridge Grappler. Let's get into some 2-ply sidewalls. So the next cab off the rank, which is the first of our 2-ply sidewall tyres, is the Cooper AT3 LT. So you can see that we're starting to get into a tread pattern that has more of these longitudinal grooves. So this one has 4 longitudinal grooves, and that's going to make it theoretically better in the wet than if it didn't have these longitudinal grooves. In terms of tread block size, the width of the tread blocks is certainly a bit bigger than the KO2. In these longitudinal grooves, I can actually fit a little finger on its side on the 2 outside ones, not so much in the middle ones, and then between the blocks in this center set of blocks, can't really fit one in there at all, apart from in a couple of them. And then in terms of the shoulders, there's not a huge amount of width there in comparison to the KO2, keeping in mind that, you know, I can actually fit it in on its side there. And then in terms of siping, we're actually starting to see a bit more siping. So again, those are those little grooves that they put in there to give it flexibility and conformity and better performance in the wet. Let's go to the shoulders. And you can sort of see here how much more aggressive the shoulder is on the KO2 than it is on the AT3 LT. There's no real stone ejector action because the grooves, the gaps between the blocks are actually quite narrow. And then we do have on the AT3 LT some of this alternating scalloped shoulder and more rounded shoulder rather than the square-edged ones that we saw before on the X-AT. So that is a bit of a win there for the AT3 LT versus some of the other tyres, but the KO2 is still certainly more aggressive. In terms of upper shoulder, there is some protection here on the AT3 LT, but again, nowhere near as much as you'll see on the KO2. So you're considering these tyres for slightly different purposes now. So this is a 2-ply sidewall tyre. It's going to be a little bit more comfortable on the road than a 3-ply sidewall tyre in general. And also consider all the other factors around, you know, wet weather traction and, you know, long, you know, what other purposes you want it for. But let's continue with the tread pattern comparison. Let's jump into the Maxxis AT771. So I'll line them up again. So the 771 is, again, it's a 2-ply sidewall tyre in comparison to the 3-ply KO2. It has 2 longitudinal grooves and 2 relatively consistent longitudinal grooves. In terms of tread block size, probably not too dissimilar in terms of tread block size. The interesting thing about the 771 is we're starting to get into this really serious, basically very focused sets of blocks. So, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is quite different from the KO2. In terms of gaps in the shoulders or width of the grooves, I can sort of fit a little finger in there, but not really. It's only in a couple of them. So again, you're considering these tyres for different purposes, but you might be thinking about purchasing them. Let's look at the shoulders. And again, The shoulders on the KO2 are a lot more aggressive. Again, there's a sort of a reason behind that, but there is a touch of scalloping here with the 771. So there is a bit of alternating going on between the sort of the legs of these shoulder blocks. There is some protection in the upper shoulder, but you're starting to see that these carcasses are a bit more flexible than the KO2 one. So this is a more comfort-oriented tyre. Slight rim protector here as well in comparison to the KO2. Let's move on. And we'll go to the Toyo AT2. Those of you in the States will be going, where's the AT3? And we haven't actually got that yet. Toyo Australia will be sending us one very soon to take a look at. You hear that, Jose? Just saying. So the AT2 is maybe moving a little bit back up the spectrum again in terms of aggressiveness. So we're looking at less of a focused longitudinal grooves, set of longitudinal grooves. We definitely still have them, but they're a little bit more broken. So, there's angles going on. So in comparison to some of the other tyres that we've looked at up to this point. In terms of block width, they're probably a little bit bigger than what you're seeing. And also, interestingly, the AT2 actually has these little sort of buttresses on the blocks as well, which we don't see on the KO2. I can definitely fit a little finger on its side in a lot of these longitudinal grooves. Shoulders, not so much, but perhaps a little bit more than the 771. But again, keep in mind, so much space over there, less space here. But this is a 2-ply sidewall tyre. So again, it's that balance between comfort and aggressiveness. Not saying that the KO2 is uncomfortable, just saying that the KO2 is a 3-ply sidewall tyre, so it's going to be slightly less comfortable, theoretically, than the AT2. But if you look at them in side by side, the actual spacings of the blocks this way is not too different, but it's more that the KO2 has so much spacing throughout the whole tread pattern, whereas this one, again, it's got these longitudinal block sets, which might make it perhaps a little bit less noisy on the road as well. But again, that's where looking more in depth at the individual reviews on the tyres that you're going to buy are a really good step when you're considering the all-terrains that you're going to purchase. So that's where I recommend heading to Tyre Review and actually reading the feedback from other users. Let's keep going. Next up is the Pirelli Scorpion AT+. And I find this one really interesting. It's actually, in theory, it's sort of similar to the KO2 in terms of how the blocks are laid out. But you'll see on the AT+, we have those longitudinal grooves, at least 2 of them. And so while it sort of has a similar feel to the block pattern on the surface of it, once you look in, there's those longitudinal grooves, and the shoulders on the AT+ are actually quite widely spaced. So finger on its side, again, finger on its side versus finger on its face, but finger on its side in a couple of these blocks on the KO2 as well. So definitely the shoulder block spacing isn't as aggressive as the KO2, but through the center of the face, it's probably a little bit more widely spaced than some of the more recent tyres that we've looked at as well. So more widely spaced across the tread face than some of the others, but on the whole, not as widely spaced as what you're going to see in the KO2. In terms of siping, the siping on the AT+, you can see it probably from where you're standing. There's more intense siping and probably slightly wider sipes in general. Again, take my knowledge with a grain of salt. I'm just telling you from what I can see. And then we'll go to the shoulders. So there is no stone ejectors through the shoulders of the AT+, which is interesting. I mean, you could sort of argue that they don't need it because they're not very widely spaced. In terms of the upper sidewall, there is this extra protection down through here, and then a groove here. So before we get into the actual upper shoulder. And so again, versus the rubber coverage that we're looking at here on the KO2 that we've mentioned before, it's probably not as much, but it is nice to see some protection here on this tyre because This is actually, it's quite an aggressive tyre really when you look at it. It's probably at the upper end of the aggressive all-terrain market before you get into the 3-pliers. Because again, this is a 2-ply sidewall tyre. Let's keep going. So, next tyre to consider is the Falken AT3W. And this is actually probably one that people would be doing a fairly direct comparison to. Things to keep in mind are that this is a 2-ply sidewall tyre, but it is a very strong construction, so it is quite heavy, particularly in comparison to some of the other tyres we're looking at, but it is quite durable as well in terms of that construction. So quite a reasonable comparison if you're thinking about buying one of these two tyres. If we look at the tread block density, you'll see that the density of the Falken AT3W is actually more dense than the KO2. So through the centre here, yes, there are some reasonable grooves. I can fit my little finger in there, but not generally into many of the grooves. So there's some spaces that I can. Then on the shoulder blocks, there's a little bit of a little finger sort of tucking in there. But again, nowhere near as wide a space as over here. In terms of siping, there's certainly a lot more siping that you'll see through the AT3W as well. So it's interesting actually, because again, this is something that you might be comparing these two tyres, but the tread block spacing is quite a lot wider in the KO2 than the AT3W, particularly through the sidewalls, the shoulder blocks here. In terms of longitudinal groove, there is a longitudinal groove here, but it's quite an interrupted one, or it follows a bit of a Z pattern. So in comparison to this one, which again, you could sort of argue that there's kind of one there, but it's definitely not as pronounced as what you'll see in the AT3W. Let's look at the shoulders. Oh, stone injectors. No stone injectors, which is probably fair, again, considering that there's not as much gap in the shoulders between the shoulder blocks as what you're seeing on the KO2. The AT3W does have a reasonable amount of shoulder protection, but you're looking at these sort of quite aggressive teeth or something like that, and then in between that, there is actually relatively naked rubber. So again, that's where the coverage of the KO2 wins through. There is some sort of groovy stuff happening between the shoulder block blades, or whatever you want to call them, on the KO2. So these blocks might help you to dig out of a spot or get out of whatever, but they're certainly not as overall aggressive. In terms of the actual upper shoulder, it's a repeating pattern of sort of quite a square corner and then these 3 steps, whereas again the KO2 has that scalloped, square shoulder, scalloped shoulder, square shoulder, scalloped shoulder. So if you're thinking about the tyre cutting through muck, then certainly the KO2 has the edge there. Again, black sidewall riding on the AT3W, but from memory it's actually different on each side. So it's actually shallower and less visible on this side, and the riding is actually deeper and more visible on this side. So, on with the show. Surely we must be almost getting there. So next tyre off the rank is actually, for some reason I didn't have it quite well coordinated, and we've dipped back into the aggressive all-terrain market again. So this is the Maxxis AT811. Again, aggressive all-terrain, so something that is a pretty good direct comparison, and this is a pretty popular tyre at the moment because it's relatively new onto the market. In terms of blocks, the blocks themselves are perhaps a little bit bigger than what you're seeing on the KO2. This one has that sort of interesting bladey sort of pattern like what we saw on the Grappler and the RT. In terms of gaps between the blocks, on the shoulders I can sort of fit a little finger on the side, not very deep except in a couple of them, but it does have reasonable spacing all the way through the tread pattern as well. It's slightly denser through the middle here, but the KO2 certainly has more wider gaps in the middle than what you're looking at on the 811. So sort of good spacing throughout, but not as wide spacing as what you're looking at on the KO2. In terms of the upper shoulder, we should talk about siping. Maybe a little bit more siping on the 811, the RAZR, than what you're looking at on the KO2, but it's questionable really. All right, stone ejectors. We do have stone ejectors on the 811 on the RAZR AT, relatively consistently through there. Not as aggressive perhaps as the KO2, but that's probably because the KO2 stone ejectors are actually, the KO2 shoulder gaps are wider than what you're looking at on the RAZR. Upper sidewall, there's a fair bit of protection here on the RAZR. They're the same on both sides. Yep, same on both sides. And so there is a bit more perhaps depth of protection, but again, you're looking at a bit of nakedness between the blocks in comparison to the coverage that you're getting from the KO2. There is also, again, that alternating square edge shoulder versus scalloped block. I would almost say that the KO2 has the edge there because it's a bit more aggressive in terms of that upper shoulder as well. I don't think there's anything more to cover, so let's keep moving on. Oh, should also say that this is a 3-ply sidewall as well, whereas same as the KO2. So this is dipping back into that 3-ply sidewall territory. And then we'll end up on the Yokohama G015. So this is certainly at the more highway-oriented end of the spectrum of all-terrain tyres. It's certainly not the most highway-oriented, not by a long shot. But if you're looking at buying a all-terrain tyre that is good off-road but also good on-road, then the G015 is an excellent option. And you probably could compare between the two. I mean, the G015 is a 2-ply sidewall tyre, 3-ply sidewall tyre again, so perhaps has more comfort factor theoretically, but you can see the difference between the two tyres here. So you've got these 4 longitudinal grooves. I can't really fit a finger on its side into any of these. Well, actually, that one I can, and that one just. So there is some width there. And the blocks themselves are quite a lot more dense than what you're looking at on the KO2. So again, same as a couple of the other tyres we've looked at, probably more through the middle here. We've got these quite densely packed blocks, which actually these ones through the middle here actually aren't full depth as well. So they only go down to maybe half the depth. So you've got, say, we can show you a close-up, but here's the surface, here's where the middle of the blocks is, and here's where the actual carcass of the tyre is. So that might help you in terms of road handling and that sort of thing on the road, because you don't have the full depth of the block, but might not be as good off the road. In terms of shoulders, again, they're not actually quite full depth through the inside of the shoulder blocks there. And there is actually some good gaps in the shoulder blocks, so I can actually fit a finger into the outside part of that, but not to the inside part of that. So that's pretty reasonable. No stone ejectors on this one because the shoulder gaps aren't very wide. The shoulder blocks themselves are probably a similar sort of size, maybe slightly smaller than the KO2. Let's look at the upper sidewall. Oh, actually this one has white writing, just for reference. Certainly not as much coverage in this one, again, probably because of the orientation of the tyre. You're seeing a little bit of protection up here in the upper sidewalls, but not as much protection as up here. So I guess, again, that speaks to the difference in the orientation between these tyres. These are a durable tyre. I mean, they're both durable, but this one is perhaps a stronger built tyre for off-road use. This one is still good for off-road use, but perhaps not as serious off-road use. Whereas this one, I know for a fact, is actually really good on the highway and is amazing for your SUVs that are probably spending more time commuting. Again, KO2, it's not like it can't do that, but the G015 is perhaps more oriented in that direction. So let's end it on that. That is the KO2 versus 10 other tread patterns that you may consider. If there's something I missed, harangue me in the comments. We might do this again at some stage, so there's no reason why we can't do that. Always up for banter. If you've used this tyre or any of the other tyres, don't hesitate to review them on tyrereview.com.au. That's where we get a lot of the data that we use in these videos. And it's always interesting to see what you think, and actually make sure you post pictures as well, because I like seeing the pictures. So, KO2 versus 10 other tread patterns. Tread pattern review. Didn't go too deep, but I think this video has been long enough, so if you've stuck with us this long, well done.